And we are live.
Hello, everybody.
Hello again, Cameron Chubb.
Hello, Kai Forster. How are you?
I'm very good. How are you on this beautiful Sunday day?
I'm very good, thank you. Can you guys believe it's the 2nd of August already? Jeepers.
So, this is episode 2 of The Outside In.
And the title of our podcast this week will be titled, Where is My Mind?
Little inspiration taken from the famous Pixies track, not gonna lie there. Gotta give the credit where it's due.
100%. I mean, Fight Club was also just an astounding movie.
Banger of a movie, absolutely. I really enjoyed that one, huh?
Great ending as well.
I mean, as far as endings go, it was a good ending.
It was quite a good ending.
Quite a good beginning as well. Good middle.
Sure,
Yeah. Good overall fucking experience.
It was a great experience, you know. And then if you look at your life almost as like a movie, you could think like, sure, where was the beginning, where was the end? Probably wouldn't know, huh? So, let's get down to the point.
So give us a few questions, or just some pondering thoughts that we can think about for the next few minutes.
So thought will be the primary focus of this podcast. And before we begin, I would like you to pause this podcast, and what you're going to do is you are going to silently contemplate your thoughts between 5 and 10 minutes at your own discretion. So close your eyes, be alone with your thoughts, and contemplate what you're thinking. And pause now. Welcome back.
Welcome back.
We missed you. We really did. We would like to know where you wandered off to. Or where did your mind wander off to, really?
That is a good question. I mean, to be completely honest with you, I can't remember the exact points that you wanted us to reflect on what we thought about over the past few minutes, so please do share this with us.
So, question 1. Please estimate how many thoughts you had, or just how many that you were aware of. And just silently say the answer in your head. Doesn't have to be out loud. So, that was my first question. Second question. Please try estimate how many of these thoughts were negative. Was it about half, less than half, more than half? Up to you. Question 3. How did these thoughts make you feel? Anxious, fearful, angry, resentful? Question 4. Did the thoughts contain any judgments? And if so, who were they directed at? Were they yourself or others? Question 5. How many of these thoughts were from your past? Next question. How many of these thoughts were from the future? Question 6 or 7. Sorry, my maths is a bit bad today. How many of these thoughts have you had before? AKA recurring thoughts. So thoughts that you thought of yesterday or the day before, or any time period really. Question 7. Do your thoughts impact your sleep? So those seem to be most of the questions that I have for you to answer. And this is merely just an exercise for you to engage with this podcast and for us to start dissecting some of the answers that you may have had, and to maybe give you sort of pointers, food for thought and to understand.
So now you were saying, how many thoughts did you have that were in the past tense? How many thoughts did you have that were in the future tense? With our minds, generally we can eliminate thoughts of anger, resentment, regret from moving our thoughts from the past into the present. Similarly, we can eliminate feelings of anxiety, worry, stress by taking our mind from the future tense and bringing it back to the present. The only reason we have these feelings that I just mentioned is because our mind oscillates into the future, which brings feelings of anxiety. We don't know what is going to happen. When we don't have any idea or any certainty of an exact outcome in the future, it creates this uncertainty in our mind. And essentially, at the end of the day, all our mind is there to do is to try to keep us as safe as possible and to try to keep us as comfortable as possible, which is one of the reasons that our mind hates being pushed out of its comfort zone. Then with feelings of anger and regret, I mean, looking back, we can think of, that embarrassing moment you had in grade 5, or that time that you hurt someone very close to you. And it's going to bring up those feelings of regret or anger or resentment, of being like, okay, why did I do this? Why was I such an idiot? Why did I hurt the person that I loved, you know?
Essentially, and if we think about it right now, well, thinking, I'm using my mind. So in order to understand what the mind is, we've got to understand how it works. And how the mind works is it essentially is there for you to think. If you could picture yourself as a computer, you could say that your eyes were possibly the keyboard, your ears were the mouse, your face was the screen, any of your senses that have been given to you, your receptors. Essentially, those are all just input devices, really. And your brain can be seen as hardware. It can be seen as the motherboard housing all the RAM components, the ROM.
Basically, a supercomputer taking our body
Exactly.
through this existence.
Exactly. So then the mind comes in. It's almost like a link between the two. The mind is essentially your CPU, your central processing unit. So it's trying to process everything you are hearing, seeing, and feeling. And with the mind, its whole exact purpose is to know. It's to think and to know. So know the definition of things. And the minute your mind goes into the future, you think of uncertainty. You're not certain. Therefore, the mind doesn't know what to do. The mind doesn't have an exact answer. The mind operates on a binary system, as in right or wrong, left or right, yes or no, good or bad. And when the mind doesn't know, it essentially loves to internalize the negative. So the mind will think of the worst possible case scenario. And the power of the mind is that it will allow you to believe it's true.
So that thing that you just said about, you know, internalizing the negative and everything, it's very easy for our minds to develop these negative thinking patterns. It's through this phenomenon called neuroplasticity. So basically what happens is our brain is made up of all of these different neurological pathways, all linking different parts of the brain to different parts of the brain, so that we can basically decode and understand the physical world going on around us, as well as like our thoughts and processing our emotions, all of that. So if we have certain negative thoughts, certain neurological pathways will be fired up, and the more often we have these negative thoughts, the more often these neurological pathways are going to be used. That being said, the more often these neurological pathways are being used and utilized, the stronger they become, and the more freely neurological impulses can flow down these paths. When this happens, we literally physically change our minds to develop negative thinking patterns. That being said, positive thinking patterns can replace these negative thinking patterns in the exact same way. When we have a positive thought, we utilize the positive thought neurological pathways in our brain, and the more often we use those pathways, the more optimistic we become in general in life. And one way that I found very effective to do this is through meditation, only focusing on positives. As you said a little bit earlier, not in the podcast, mantras are also a very effective way. Saying, for example, I am happy, I am happy. If you're telling your mind 300 times in a day, I am happy, your mind is going to fucking think, I am ecstatic, I'm happy.
No, very interesting. I mean, especially with this book I've been reading called The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari.
Yeah.
So, quick lowdown for all our listeners. It's about a lawyer, a trial lawyer, very well known, Julian Mansell, multi-millionaire, lives a very much an unsustainable lifestyle, has a heart attack in the courtroom one day, and basically has an awakening that I need to change my life.
In the courtroom, that's pretty quite an eventful court meeting, yeah?
In the courtroom. Yeah, that's like some Law and Order shit right there.
Jeez.
So he leaves, he sells all his worldly possessions, and he leaves and goes to India. And he is in search of an ancient civilization called the Savannah. The sages of Savannah are people that are essentially monks that have been carrying this wisdom from ancient years ago, prehistoric days, of ancient words of wisdom and rituals passed down from civilization, from generations to generations, and have ultimately made the civilization that exists within the Himalayas. He goes there, and essentially he learns rituals to basically live a radiant life. Mantras, essentially what Kai just told you, is developing positive thinking patterns. So man means mind in the Savannah language, or Sanskrit actually. And then tra means free. So essentially a mantra means free your mind. And to free your mind, you essentially need to have positive thinking patterns, because the minute you have negative thinking patterns, you start establishing a structure, a ceiling around your mind. And then you start realizing that, wow, my life is actually a structure, basically a metaphorical idea for my mind. If I see my life as chaotic, then the inside of my mind is chaotic. If I see my life as very much limited, then my mind is limited.
Just that point that you made right now, do you think it works both ways, or do you think it works one way only? So if you have a peaceful mind, chances are you'll have experienced a peaceful life. Do you think if you experience a peaceful life, you will experience a peaceful mind by default? Do you think it kind of works both ways? So you can start with a peaceful mind and then develop a peaceful life, or develop a peaceful life and then get a peaceful mind consequently? Or how do you think this relationship works? Just like a brief answer.
I would say having a peaceful mind translates a lot quickly, much more fast into having a peaceful life. The other way around will take a lot longer.
Okay, fair. That's a good answer.
Personally for me, because I've had many instances in my life where life outside of me was not peaceful, and it took me a lot longer to develop a peaceful mind. But essentially everything that you see is internalized by the mind, and that you hear through your receptors. So your CPU, whatever it's taking in, it's internalizing and it's interpreting what you're seeing. So if you're interpreting everything around you as peaceful, it will be peaceful. If you're interpreting everything as happy and joyous and light, then it will be. So it's essentially just the state of your mind, really. So the mind, as we've said, is a very powerful tool, which is quite understandable. I mean, it can tell you stories and give you fables. Referring back to the question of how many of your thoughts have ventured out into the distance, into the future, the horizon of the unknown, and how they made you feel. They probably made you feel fearful, uncertain, unhappy. And essentially what fear is false evidence appearing real. So your mind has false evidence, because the evidence doesn't actually exist, makes it feel real, and then you fear it. So the judge, the segment of the judge is your mind judges, not just you, but everyone else around you. And you start to believe those judgments as well. That's where the belief system, the second segment, comes in. And essentially when the mind judges you, yourself, you become the victim of your own mind, and you believe those judgments because you think they're the truth. So that's essentially the three segments of the actual mind, and that's how it works.
I mean, beyond that, the mind is responsible for so much, actually. Everything that we perceive, everything we experience around us, our five senses, constantly giving input from the surrounding environment to our mind so we can make sense of what is going on. Obviously, voluntary movements, involuntary bodily functions, like the regulation of hormones, your blood pumping. I mean, it's not like we actively think about our heart pumping blood around our body. There's so much going on in the brain at any given point, and then beyond that, processing emotions, processing experiences, learning, which is a huge part of the human mind. And the human mind has really, over the past, especially century or so, expanded in leaps and bounds in terms of technological intelligence and enabling humans to achieve so much than ever thought possible. I mean, we've sent people to the moon. We've been able to, humans have managed to do things previously thought completely impossible, and it's happening a lot. So this basically tells us that our minds are our most powerful tool in the whole world, probably. I mean, there's nothing quite as powerful and intricate as the human mind. That being said, it is also the biggest and our only limit in pursuing our wildest dreams. I think you mentioned fear, which literally most of the time it's our biggest inhibition, basically. It's about getting around this fear that we can, break down the mental barriers and expand our own consciousness, expand our own mind. Because when with pushing our comfort zones, for example, a comfort zone only exists because we haven't ever experienced something outside of this comfort zones, for example. So think of the comfort zone as a little circle. This is the limits of your mind. So now if you always perform your actions within this little limit of your mind, it's not going to grow at all. It's going to stay the same size. If you decide one day, okay, I'm going to go just beyond the circle, then your mind will have to expand slightly to accommodate this experience and make sense of what's going on in this experience. So as a result, you kind of take your consciousness into this uncharted territory, this new unfamiliar thing, which is why it's an uncomfortable experience. It's something unfamiliar. The brain doesn't know what to expect. And when we do this and we come out of this uncomfortable experience fine, our minds will be like, okay, cool, so this uncharted territory is actually safe. I can venture back into this region because it's no longer foreign or uncomfortable to me. And in doing so, we can expand our comfort zones literally day by day, just by doing one small activity that we wouldn't usually be doing. And in doing so, our brains will also, or our minds will become more resilient and more open and accepting to new challenges in the future.
Very correct. I couldn't agree more with what you've just said. If I could tell the listeners, if you could picture your mind as a beautiful, lush, fertile garden, loads of plants just blossoming at the earliest sight of spring, butterflies, beautiful. Or you could picture your mind as basically dry, deserted. Depends on how you are watering this garden of yours that you call your mind. But it all depends on what seeds you're planting in this garden of yours. What type of garden do you want to have of your mind? Do you want to have a beautiful, lush garden? Or would you like to have a dry, arid garden? It all really depends on yourself. Those seeds are actually metaphors for your thoughts. So delightful treasures and boundless riches really do await you if you start planting seeds of positive thought. The more you water these seeds, the more they sprout. The more the neuroplasticity, as what Kai had so beautifully demonstrated for us and spoke about, is you basically are watering positive thoughts. You keep having positive thoughts, you start believing these positive thoughts, you start converting them into action and converting them into your reality. What we like to say here as part of one of our sayings on this podcast channel is change your thoughts, change your feelings, change your actions, you change your inner world, and then you change the world outside of you. You will start to see that possible dreams that you've had about yourself, possible realities that could even exist, will actually start occurring because they've been manifestations of thought, which is very interesting. And I would like to think that's quite amazing as well. But now we've been talking so much about having positive thoughts, but you're probably sitting there wondering, but how do you get there? And the question is not really how do you get there, is why do we get there? Why do we want to have positive thoughts, Essentially, why would you want to have a positive thought instead of a negative thought?
Yeah. It's pretty clear that negative thoughts do not serve much purpose. The only reason we have negative thoughts is because our mind is trying to keep us safe at any given time, The mind's number one priority is our survival. That's it. So I read something interesting a while ago. Basically, it said when we have a negative or seemingly negative emotion or feeling, like embarrassment in front of a big crowd, feeling of intense anger or rage, a feeling of deep sadness, what our mind is actually fearing is the bodily sensations of those experiences, not the actual experiences themselves. So these bodily sensations only last for about 90 seconds or so. So if you can push through those 90 seconds of this absolute discomfort, you'll be able to master any negative emotion. And the thing is, we can use negative emotions to our advantage. First of all, we mustn't think of them as negative emotions, but rather uncomfortable emotions. They simply serve a purpose. They help us come to terms with past traumas, past events, So I think this article that I read, there were three main guidelines to harnessing the power of uncomfortable thoughts and emotions, and to essentially guide us towards emotional mastery, if you can call it that. One, decision, so choose to always be conscious of your emotions and your thoughts and everything. 90 seconds, that'll be the 90 seconds that it takes to dissipate these uncomfortable feelings. And 8 feelings, there are only 8 uncomfortable emotions out there to us, if you think about it. Then one thing also that interests me is, where do thoughts come from? So I know you just said that 95% of our thoughts are simply recycled from the previous day, and this could obviously link onto neuroplasticity of the same thought pathways being utilized over and over again. But another thing that I'm wondering is, why do our best ideas come when the mind is silent? Often mind-blowingly good ideas in the shower, for example, when we're watering the garden, doing a very calm, mindful activity where our brain isn't too stimulated besides the actual task at hand, which is just being, not really doing much.
I would say it's mostly presence. Essentially when you are present in the moment, you actually have the most logic and the most clarity with approaching any solution, any problem, and finding that solution. I find often our mind, as we have clearly stated, and why we ask those questions of how many thoughts did you have in the future, how many did you have in the past, the mind loves to oscillate between time frames. It loves to spend time in the future, which creates fear, feelings of anxiety, uncertainty. And it likes to resort to past previous experiences, and many of them being traumas as well. The mind likes to uncover trauma, and it likes to feel that trauma again, loves to internalize that negativity that we've experienced in our past lives. And that is essentially the job of the mind. It's there to, as you said, protect you, survivalist instinct. So often people say our natural instincts in life is survival of the fittest, essentially. But coming to those topics, we'll talk about that in another podcast. That's a whole separate scenario in itself. But that being said, the minute you are present, you start to see things differently, and you really do. And the whole idea of what the mind is, it likes to play out scenarios of how things are going to happen. It likes to prepare you. Like, say, for a test, you approach a test and you think they're going to ask this question, and that question. How often do you find when they don't ask the questions that you think they're going to ask, you get flustered?
Panic.
You feel overwhelmed. And the thing is, the difficulty of those questions are not probably the topics or the way they apply in the knowledge. It's not anything different to how you've learned before, but it's different. It's something you haven't prepared for. The thing is, the moment you feel that you're panicking, in a panicky situation, you start feeling pressure, you start releasing cortisol, which is types of stress hormones, and it breaks down neural pathways within your brain. And essentially, your mind isn't as clear. You wouldn't have as much clarity as approaching any solution. So that being said, to get present, if we split that word up, present, that is essentially what the mind is doing. It is pre-sending you scenarios that will play out, that could possibly play out. But as we've seen in so many instances, no one would think COVID-19 would hit us in 2020. So plans change, things change. So what can we do? Well, we can essentially not look into the future, can't control it, can't look into the past either, it's already happened. So what can we do? We focus on the present. And when we react to situations, we find we're merely reacting, which is a reenactment of how we've acted before. So we're not actually growing. So essentially, you should start seeing and looking at situations differently and responding and not reacting. Because the moment you start seeing things differently, you add see to react, you actually start creating. And that's what we want to do here. We want to create a life. We want to manifest these thoughts that we're having. But if we think about it, what is a thought? Kai, please elaborate.
So that was the end of part 1. Please stay tuned for part 2. The link will be somewhere easy for you to find. See you, Nana.